was the West actually enabled the rise of China by allowing China into the World Trade Organization, by allowing China essentially to flout the rules of trade and cheat the system.
Made a fundamental mistake in the 1990s and in the first 20 years of the 21st century in helping China to become Godzilla. It's come back to haunt us, and we're now...
We graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch.
在观察者研究基金会的一期节目中，英国前首相利兹·特拉斯、美国著名国际关系学者约翰·米尔斯海默等西方鹰派人物就中国崛起、全球化走向以及美国如何应对中国展开了一场激烈讨论。其中一句“我们犯了一个错误，让中国变成了哥斯拉”，更是成为争议焦点。过去几十年，西方推动全球化，希望中国融入现有体系，但如今面对中国不断增强的产业实力，美国又开始用关税、技术限制和产业回流来踩刹车。问题来了，当初亲手打开全球化大门的人，如今为什么又急着给中国的发展踩刹车？这场关于哥斯拉的争论背后究竟藏着怎样的大国博弈？
I don't think it's inevitable we've moved into a multipolar world. What I think happened was the West actually enabled the rise of China by allowing China into the World Trade Organization, by allowing China essentially to flout the rules of trade and cheat the system. And what I think we're now seeing under President Trump is a pushback.
I think the last round of globalization, which has been about 30 years, maybe 40 years, had of course generated tremendous amount of economic prosperity and wealth, and China certainly was one of the largest beneficiaries of this globalization, and so has the United States been. Both of our countries' GDP went up significantly. China went up a lot more because we began at a lower base. But the problem with globalization as it stands is, I think it cannot go on for two reasons. One is, I think within the United States and the West, somehow the economic benefits derived from globalization weren't distributed in a way that satisfied multiple segments of its population. So it's led to an internal revolt against globalization. So the architect of this first round of globalization is having internal resistance to it. So that's, of course, leading to deglobalization, because the leader of the globalization was saying, we don't want to do this anymore. And the second issue is, of course, that the largest developing country that participated in globalization was China. And in the beginning, I think they had designed it in a way that the US and Western countries were at the core of globalization, and there were countries, developing countries, at the periphery. And the division of labor was clear. You know, the US and Western Europe were going to be in charge of R&D and finance and military, and we're going to do cheap labor and sell natural resources if we had them. China didn't have them, but others had them, and provide market. But of course, as China grew, it said, no, we didn't agree to that. We're going to move up the value chain. And unfortunately, the US and certain Western countries, they thought this, perceived that as a threat. So they didn't want to do that anymore. So I think we're in, yeah, globalization is in trouble. But let me also comment on the liberal international order. I'm not sure where that came from. Certainly when China signed up to the WTO, it wasn't told it was signing up to the liberal international order. It wasn't such thing. I mean, I think it was made up in retrospect. I mean, I think when President Jiang went to Washington, when China was trying to enter the WTO, President Bill Clinton didn't say, hey, President Jiang, you're signing up to the liberal international order. It didn't happen. So it was never there. So that's my 2 cents.
Made the point that both China and the United States got much richer during the unipolar moment when we had globalization. And he's, of course, correct. And the United States didn't care about that because the United States thought that once China got really rich and it got embedded in international institutions, it would become a responsible stakeholder, to use Robert Zoellick's term, and then it would become a democracy, and once it was a democracy, we'd all live happily ever after. This would be the end of history. That was the basic idea. But it didn't turn out that way because once China got really powerful economically, it translated that economic might into military might, and it began to throw its muscle around. And this, of course, scared the living bejesus out of the Americans, and the Americans have moved to counter China. We now care about relative gains. See, Eric was talking about absolute gains where we're both getting rich, and we didn't care about relative gains then. But now that China's a great power, we care about relative gains. So what we want to do is we want to maximize American growth, and we want to minimize Chinese growth. Anything we can do to slow down the Chinese economy and refurbish the American economy, we will do. And you see this reflected in the competition over cutting-edge technologies. We're extremely scared that China is going to beat us in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies. Now, where do tariffs come in? Tariffs are part of the story. What we're trying to do with tariffs is modernize, refurbish the American industrial base, make us much more competitive, and we're trying to weaken China at the same time. Because again, we care about relative power. And all of this is to say that I agree with you, Liz, that we made a fundamental mistake in the 1990s and in the first 20 years of the 21st century in helping China to become Godzilla. It's come back to haunt us, and we're now trying to rectify that. And again, tariffs are part of that story.
Let me comment on that.
Let Eric comment on this.
I think well, of course, like I said, both countries benefit tremendously. But if the United States, certainly the U.S. did not set up the system and ask China to join out of charity. I really don't think so. They thought that they would benefit too. That's number one. Number two, if the U.S. thought that if China develops and eventually it will become a liberal country, they never told us that. Nobody told us that. It was a secret intent. It wasn't disclosed in the prospectus. Okay, we signed up to WTO, and there was a prospectus, there were a bunch of rules, a lot of text, a lot of words, nothing in it that said, hey, if your economy develops, you must become a liberal society. It wasn't there. We didn't sign up to that, like I said. So I think, well, look, if the U.S. is now changing its path, changing its direction, that's completely within its power to do. It's a sovereign nation. Tariffs and all of that, if the globalization, if the United States wants to ditch globalization for its own needs, I think China will adapt. Everybody has to adapt. It's okay. I think China will do okay in this new era, and it will adapt.
I can just say a word picking up on what you said. I think the way to think about the world we're moving into is to separate the economic from the security competition and think about it in the context of the pre-World War I period, not the Cold War. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, what is he talking about? Before World War I, here in Europe, there was a huge amount of economic intercourse among all of the states. There was a huge amount of economic interdependence here in Europe. Nevertheless, at the same time, you had two powerful security blocs. One was the Triple Entente, which was France, Britain, and Russia, and the other was the Triple Alliance. Germany, of course, was the key player, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And you had this intense security competition before World War I that, of course, in August 1914, led to World War I. But at the same time you had this intense security competition, you had all this economic interdependence. Fast forward to the Cold War, when I grew up, there was hardly any economic intercourse between the West and the East. So there was security competition, but no economic intercourse. The situation moving forward is going to look like the pre-World War I period. It's not going to look like the Cold War. There's going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between India and China, the United States and China, Europe and China. The key issue inside the economic realm will have to do with high-edge or cutting-edge technologies. That's what the United States really cares about in terms of the competition with China. And just to take Europe and how this competition will affect Europe, there's no question, given the economic state of Europe, that European states will have a powerful incentive to want to trade with China. And the United States will tolerate that as long as Europeans don't trade cutting-edge technologies to the Chinese. Because what the Americans are trying to do, as Eric knows very well, is the Americans are trying to throttle, slow down China's development of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States is not going to be happy if Europe trades cutting-edge technologies or technologies that feed into cutting-edge technologies with China. But nevertheless, Europeans, Americans, Indians, we're going to trade with the Chinese. But at the same time, you're going to have a wicked and very dangerous security competition in East Asia for many, many years moving forward.
Eric?
I think if the United States wants to contain China through technological means, which is understandable, then I think they're pursuing very mistaken tactics. I mean, I don't understand why. I mean, by cutting off semiconductor, for instance, when Mr. Biden did, and the Chinese were asleep at the wheel for a long time on the stuff. They woke up the Chinese and said, whoa, this is what they could do to us. And listen, we graduate more STEM students than the rest of the world combined. Okay, and we got research dollars more than the rest of the world combined. If you don't think we can lick semiconductor, you gotta be out to lunch. I mean, so I just don't think that's the productive way to go about it. By the way, I totally understand. I think the Chinese understand the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. If I were running the United States, I would want to reindustrialize too. I just wish there could be a friendlier way to go about it externally. And I actually think, that's why I'm actually reasonably optimistic. I actually think the Chinese would be willing to cooperate and maybe contribute to that effort. Certainly China is the largest industrial power in the world. There's some kind of accommodation that could be reached, I believe, if we pursue a friendlier atmosphere.
说到底，让中国变成哥斯拉这句话真正刺眼的地方，并不是这个比喻有多夸张，而是它暴露了西方如今越来越明显的焦虑。过去全球化让中国和美国都赚到了钱，只不过中国没有停在西方预想的位置，而是一路向制造业、高科技和完整产业链上游冲了过去。当中国从全球化参与者变成全球化竞争者，游戏规则也开始悄悄改变。如今，美国试图通过关税、技术限制和产业回流重新拉开差距，中国也在加速寻找新的发展路径。半导体、新能源、先进制造等领域的竞争，已经不再只是单纯的贸易摩擦，而是在重新塑造全球产业版图。曾经西方希望全球化能够按照自己的剧本发展，却没想到中国最终走出了自己的道路。 如今这只所谓的哥斯拉已经站在世界舞台上，想再把它塞回原来的位置，显然没有那么容易。而随着更多国家开始在中美之间寻找自己的利益空间，一个更加多元的全球格局也正在一步步成为现实。